Hey guys, welcome. How you doing today?
Good, Beth. Hey, how you doing?
Amazing. Hey Scott, how's it going?
Hey, how are you?
Perfect. Well, thank you guys for being here. We really appreciate it. Before we get started with our talk, I'm going to have us all introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about our experience. But even before that, I'm going to go ahead and set the stage for what we'll be discussing. Obviously, we know that we're experiencing a pretty dramatic change in the way that we do business and the way the economy is. So a lot of us are really wondering what the future of business is going to look like. And we want to know how businesses can recover today while still preparing for tomorrow, and what opportunities really exist for those aspiring businesses and startups to take advantage of, even in this time. So before we get into the questions, let's all introduce ourselves. Richard, let's start with you.
Okay, great, no problem. Hi, I'm Richard Christina, originally born and raised in Australia. My career has seen me in a lot of product marketing and business development roles for SMEs in Australia. A big chunk of my career, though, there I helped start a consumer goods company from scratch, and we exited for millions, and that brought me to the UK. Here I have worked for a number of startups. I decided to formally join the startup ecosystem and become a consultant, which I run in my business Bloom. And I'm also a director for the Founder Institute, which many will know are a startup accelerator, a global startup accelerator.
Amazing. Scott, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Scott Steinberg. Nice to meet all you folks. And I actually head up the International Association for Business Development and Strategic Partnerships. And I've written a number of books on how to innovate and stay ahead of the curve. So also currently work as a futurist and consultant with some of today's largest Fortune 500 brands, helping them think about what products, services, and solutions they should bring to market and what's coming next. So always top of mind here. And as you can imagine, time of great change. So I have a live discussion today.
Yeah, thank you. Aaron?
Hey, Beth. Thank you. My name's Aaron Tangwell. I kind of had a long history in startups, both on the entrepreneurial side as well as on the accelerator side. Currently, I'm a startup designer at a company called Founders Factory. We're an incubator and accelerator across 4 continents, and we partner with corporates as well as startups to bring the future of startups.
Amazing. Great. So I think let's, and Aaron, I think if you're able to get a little bit closer to your speaker, that'd be great. It's just a little bit soft. Okay. But let's start really quickly with just jumping right into it. Do you think that now is a good time for businesses or aspiring entrepreneurs to launch new projects? And why or why not? Scott, let's start with you.
Well, I would argue it's always a good time, and actually maybe now better than ever, because the barriers to entry have come down so low that pretty much anything you're looking to do, you can begin to assemble in less time and at less cost than ever before. And by the way, in times like these, there's an awful lot of talent out there who's probably sitting on the sidelines looking for new opportunities or ways to partner. So I would argue it's a good time to be prototyping and testing new ideas when you can afford to fail cost affordably, and when you can afford to do it quickly. And maybe sometimes some of these will go under the radar, but the real thing is to use times like these as a learning experience and to educate yourselves and to see what's out there and really begin to try new business ideas. And keep in mind that 9 out of 10 startups are going to succeed with a different idea than they went in with. So you could argue that just about any point starting a business, you're going to wind up with something different. So you might as well get started at the moment.
Yeah. Richard, what do you think?
I definitely agree with Scott. I would say, and I'm asked this question quite a lot, any time is a good time to start a business, but more so in post-COVID environment. It's not really about the environment that we're in has created a lot of opportunities. And why? Well, I guess, the way we go about our day-to-day activities is changing. So, and there's a need to change. For instance, the way we interact with products and services. You take the airline industry, and they're looking for a complete touch-free, from as soon as you enter the airport to getting on the plane environment, so you don't have to touch things, because of COVID. So, there's a lot of tech that's gone into that. So, yes, any time's a good time if you can find product market fit and a need, importantly, the need for that product and service. But even more so, there's new opportunities because of COVID.
Yeah, Aaron, do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I think at the Founders Factory on the Startup Studio, we build about 24 businesses a year, and that is because right now we do think it's the best time to be building startups, and we see opportunity across various sectors. The airline industry, we work with EasyJet, and so we're kind of identifying new opportunities there. But then it's just so broad, and even at a smaller stake, I've been helping over the last 4 months, helping like offline businesses digitize, and so there's this. I'm quite excited for this kind of next wave of businesses that have been kind of forced into the kind of digital sphere and seeing what they can do now that they've realized it's not as intimidating as it may have been.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're right. I mean, the push for digital transformation is the sense of urgency has never been as big as it is now. Part of the reason why we wanted to provide this conference and give these sorts of answers and talk about these things is because we've been hearing from our own community that there are a lot of people who, one, want to take advantage of this opportunity, but two, they really don't have another choice, right? So I'm excited to discuss that and dig a little bit deeper with you guys. I want to ask what advice you typically give to an aspiring business or startup, and if that would change at all now during COVID or post-COVID. Richard, let's start with you there.
Yeah, sure. I think the core piece of advice typically remains the same. The work that we do at Founder Institute, for example, in the program, we really push the founders to go out and validate their idea and find product market fit. So any business any founder wanting to start up, that process typically has to take place. Adopting lean techniques, which we can talk about it in more detail if you need to. But yeah, so I think that typically is the same. I don't think the opportunities that we've referred to already. That process wouldn't change. But what I would caution is that need that is there now post COVID going to remain? Is it for a business, a long-lasting business, or is it a little bit more fad-ish, if I may use that word? So, the same product market fit analysis needs to apply, yet it would be different for something that might be just a temporary need by users or customers.
Scott, would you agree with that? Is there other advice that you would give?
100%. And what I would add on to it is what Nike said way back when, is that you really just need to do it. So a lot of times we assume we're not qualified to solve a problem. A lot of times the hardest step is simply knowing where to begin. But the reality is, as you folks, of course, know, most of the solutions are now just a click or call away. So if that's the case, really, you just need to step up to the plate. And if you have a great idea, begin testing it, begin validating it, and not going completely all in. I think the thing to keep in mind is not always an either or. A lot of entrepreneurs will start out and they'll have day jobs or side hustles. You can test the waters. And by the way, the other thing to keep in mind is you can do it with a minimum viable prototype. So a lot of people say, well, you've got all these companies raising millions to build pieces of software, but in the end, success only comes down to somebody click and download and actually see if that button will bring them the piece of software. If you can't get people to sign up on a website, which is a hell of a lot to build than an entire software solution or product, then maybe you shouldn't have built the product to begin with. So think about how you can hack your way. And again, that's designing a product with a minimum of features, a minimum of options, and a minimum of time and cost. Whatever you can do to get to market and validate that idea, the faster that's going to help you out in the long run.
How do you identify what that MVP is?
Well, you basically need to come up with an idea that you can summarize in 20 seconds or less, and you need to keep it as simple as possible. That means you really need 1 to 3 unique sales points, something that clearly differentiates you at a glance. And the other piece of this, too, is that if they're easy to copy and somebody can do it, rest assured that somebody will do it, and competitors will rise, and you'll have to deal with it. So I always say, look for what is your advantage. What can you do, whether it's through obtaining a patent, through its new technologies, through its access to different contacts and networks, that somebody is going to find hard to replicate. But again, bring it down to 1 to 3 key things that you do really, really well.
Got it.
Can I add something to that, Beth, if I may?
Of course, of course.
I absolutely agree there. And also creating, developing a hypothesis. What are you trying to prove is the need of this user group? And once you come up with that, top 2 or 3 we recommend, it's going out with very basic prototyping. A prototype could be drawings on a bit of paper. It could be you just sitting down and having a meeting with someone and saying, hey, is this your pain? Or how do you do something currently? And once we've started to touch on the lean process, it's iterate, and keep doing that until you start building a basic prototype. And you can do that quite cheaply.
Yeah, I think that makes it seem a lot more accessible because I think a lot of people, when they think about the idea of creating their own business, it's this monumental task, right? And you don't see how you can get from point A to point B, thinking that point B is, your fully flushed, multi-employee, Fortune 500 company, right? But there are things that are accessible and smaller steps to break it down on the way. So I think that's very good advice. Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Richard kind of touched on the point towards the end there, is that speaking to users. It's like taking your ideas out to your customers or potential customers as quickly as possible. I think even personally thinking back to myself, the biggest mistakes I've ever made is where I've strayed away from speaking consistently to users. And then you start to kind of rely on your own assumptions. And it's easy to kind of get into a cycle of creating and not showing, and staying in the safety of stealth mode.
Right.
It's important to kind of keep shipping or just keep going back out to users as you kind of iterate and build with them. You don't need to be like a visionary. Most businesses aren't built like Steve Jobs, kind of dreaming up the iPhone. It's speaking to the customer and understanding their pains and needs.
Yeah.
That resonates.
I'm glad that you brought up mistakes, right? Because I'd love to ask you, Richard and Scott, if there's any mistakes in the way that you've thought about things in the past that now that you have that perspective, you've kind of thought, man, I don't want to get trapped in that style of thinking. Richard, is there anything that comes to mind?
Oh, there's a ton of them. How long have we got? I was involved in a startup where, we're putting money into it. And, one of the biggest mistakes founders make is they are too, we say it in our program, they're too in love with their idea. You've got to be passionate about your idea, but it's got to have a product market fit. You're going to hear me say that a lot in this tonight. And if that product market, if you can't get that, there's no point going forward. And a lot of mistakes we make as founders is that we love our idea and think everyone will love it as well. But sometimes that's not the case. It's a bit more of a hobby business. It's a nice to have. On the scale of 1 to 10, how painful is that pain that you're solving? That's the question.
Yeah, is the need big enough for you to justify it? What about you, Scott?
I would say be flexible, keep an open mind. Don't get so married to one idea or one strategy that you can't turn on a dime. The trick is we often develop tunnel vision as entrepreneurs. The more deep we get into any given idea or game plan, and the reality is you're constantly going to have to shift. The market is going to dictate ever more so going forward after COVID what your game plan needs to be. So really you need to stay attuned to what your customers want, how those needs are changing, and wherever possible you want to try and use technology as a way to predict, keep tabs on their behavior, and maybe even guess what it is they want before they know they want it. The other piece of that is many entrepreneurs think you have to do it all yourself, and we tend to get enmeshed in this idea of celebrating hustle culture. But the reality is you're going to burn out if you don't think about ways that you can delegate, work with others. And in fact, by the way, partnership oftentimes is the best way forward. Why do you have to go out and aggregate an audience or customer base if you can find a number of other businesses that you can work with that can help you, maybe who have already aggregated that customer base, or find ways to partner and team up that can help you get things done faster and much more effectively without having to burn yourself out, put in all that time. So you really got to have a good balance there, and you got to be pretty brutal when it comes to working most efficiently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Richard, you touched on this a little bit earlier when you started talking about lean solutions, but what do you think traditional businesses can learn from startup methodology to really help with these rapid changes in circumstances now, so larger businesses can be a little bit more agile?
Yeah, you often hear established businesses are always looking for ways to innovate and adopt that entrepreneurial culture within an existing organisation.
Mm-hmm.
I think banks are a really good example of this. There are a lot of London, for example, you've got Barclays Innovation Centre, London Rise, they're developing fintech ideas. The problem, and I'm just generalising here a little bit, I'm not talking about them specifically, once they get to launch, they get swallowed up by the big machine that is this corporate, and then they lose their agility to respond to market and customer needs quick enough. And then often, there's too much red tape, too much bureaucracy within the business, and some of these, some pretty good startups that I've seen, just they don't really go further than launch because the big machine swallowed them up. So, I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but a lot of these bigger corporations are trying to get that culture, but why startups can get that massive growth and fast is because they're agile and they're listening to their customers quickly.
Yeah. And would you agree with that? Or do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think so. The company I work for, Founders Factory, we're a corporate-backed accelerator and incubator. So the fund was raised through corporate partners like EasyJet, Aviva, etc. And one of the reasons they partner with us is, well, for many reasons, but partly because in a hope for that kind of symbiotic innovation, like for them to be able to learn through how we function and the startups that we invest in on their behalf. And they kind of hope that the kind of influence can spread back into the company. But I think complex things are complex, and when a big organization is as big as it is, I always think the best, as the company gets bigger, I think you do have to up into squads of innovation, and then it becomes just a good management structure that can kind of still support innovation. I think innovation is hard to do in big teams. Like the 2 pizza rule from Jeff Bezos is a thing that I truly believe in, and yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Scott, you want to weigh in?
Well, I only chuckle because learning to think like an entrepreneur is, in fact, the way forward. What we say is flexibility is the essence of future proofing. As Aaron and Richard have pointed out, things are going to change constantly. You're going to be dealing with more risk than ever. But really what we're talking about at the heart of this is empowering employees to keep a closer ear to the ground and empowering them to take more risks, but structuring those risks in such a way that they're learning experiments and that you're gathering the knowledge gained through them and quickly applying it to adapt and develop better business strategies. So the irony, I give dozens of keynote speeches a year, and it all comes back to culture. It's really about getting rid of that fear, getting rid of that stigma, and realizing that corporate processes and procedures need to be an enabler for innovation. Usually they inhibit it, things die on the vine as you try and go up the ranks. What we're talking about is a complete restructuring that puts more power in the hands of any given individual and allows them to run things up the flagpole, connect with people, have flattened lines of communication where everybody's talking, everybody is listening to the customer. And by the way, study after study, the irony shows your customers are your #1 best source of successful, innovative, new ideas, and then surface those insights and adapt to them very quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really not rocket science.
I mean, you mentioned failure, and I think that there is obviously a huge stigma against failure and making mistakes and all of these things, right? I think that most people, when they're looking to start a business or create a new idea or be innovative, are very afraid of doing something wrong and failing. So how do you learn to navigate that? How do you circumvent that thinking within yourself? Richard, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is you want your founders to fail in the first instance, because there's nothing worse. And I can put my hand up and say this is what I was referring to earlier, that spending thousands and thousands of pounds on an MVP and a basic beta launch of a product no one really wanted, because we were scared to fail. We were scared to keep asking what, the idea of the lean process and proving your hypothesis, which I mentioned earlier, is you actually want to find someone that tells you you're wrong. That's what you're aiming to do. And if you can't find them, and if you do that job thorough enough, that's when you should feel comfortable to go forward and say, actually, we do now have product market fit. There's nothing else we can do with this prototype. So failing is good, especially if it's at the start.
Yeah.
So you don't waste time and resources.
Aaron, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. My first kind of step into startups was naively starting a business out of with a friend at university, and it was two of the hardest slogs. Kind of, as Scott mentioned before, really embracing hustle culture, because we thought that's what you have to do, and we failed like time and time again, and it was kind of trial by fire that I think made me a better entrepreneur, and it's kind of really helped my career going forward. But I don't think those lessons necessarily need to be learned the hard way with money, time, or resources sacrificed. Where if you, as Richard says, just kind of embrace that experimental mindset. As Scott alluded to before, don't get married to your ideas. I think it's tough because it's you're not trained like that at school,
right?
Or even in a workplace, you're trained to deliver results. So you do have to kind of unlearn some of the things that society teaches you to kind of put that kind of innovation hat on and be kind of embrace failure.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. If I can just add to that, what Aaron was saying is, when you were referring to the larger corporations and the differentiation between them and a startup. So, the difference is, as he's touched on, they don't celebrate or they don't encourage their teams to take risks, because taking risks means there's a real high chance you're going to fail. But the secret is to learn from that and move forward again, learn from that. And it's almost like a lean process there itself. So, that to me lies the bigger problems with the larger corporations that aren't encouraging that culture of take a risk if it's okay to fail.
Yeah. I want to ask, there's an audience question that just popped up that I want to bring into the conversation. And it's about strategy as a startup. And how do you look for investments, and how do you find the best team to work on your ideas when you have these limited funds? What would you say to that, Scott?
Well, let's take that in two pieces. So if you're thinking about the strategy and where to focus, you obviously want to bet on what's going to produce profitability the fastest, which means that you have to go through a series of exercises to pare your idea down to the basics and really cut to the crux of what it is you have to offer that solves the customer pain point very quickly and most cost affordably. And you have to think about how you can do that a lot as you begin to refine that idea. In terms of investment, it's very challenging, because what most of us are looking for these days, and I'm an angel investor myself, is that essentially we want to see a predictable business model. We want to see repeated business over time, and that you have that source of unfair competitive advantage that really sets you apart. So I know that your position is going to be very hard to assail. If you don't have that, the single best thing you're going to have going for you is a pretty killer prototype. But again, that prototype, that show versus tell, which is so important, that can be assembled in a matter of weeks versus months or even years. So I will neither confirm nor deny, but some of the most successful pitches we had when we were going out looking for investors to build a vertical slice, like a one-level demo of a video game, as opposed to the entire frickin' video game, then put up a beautiful website, screenshots, do an amazing trailer, all of which can be done for pennies on the dollar compared to completing the product itself, and then go use that to raise funds. But really, if you don't have anything to show but an idea or some sketches, it's going to put you in a disadvantageous position.
Yeah. Aaron, what do you think? I mean, what advice do you give to founders when they're looking to build their initial teams and go out and sort of start knocking on doors about their products?
Yeah, I think on the teams question, it's always, I always advise kind of looking within your own networks. there's over the last few years, there's loads of like kind of meetup events where you can kind of speed date founders, potential co-founders. And I think that's okay, but I think the best founding teams do come from kind of long-time friendships, or at least careers that have been shared in some way or form, so you know and trust them both from a personal and a professional capacity. And ultimately, if you are the kind of embodiment of this startup idea, you have to be its best and biggest salesman or saleswoman. And in that sense, it's on you to kind of sell the idea to the second person that's going to be like, okay, I'm not only going to kind of fly this flag of this startup idea, but also kind of pick up arms and go to war with you.
Yeah.
And then on the investment piece, I think, because we're based in the UK in London, and it's definitely a different type of investment landscape than it is to the States or anywhere else, a bit risk adverse. So my advice tends to be like, don't line up like you're building a venture scale startup. Like, don't line up like you're trying to build Facebook, which is pre-revenue for many, many years, because that's not going to get investment. Scott said it on his first line. I think that's what it is. It's like aim for a profitable business. Aim for a business that, worst case, you don't get investment, you can still grind it out twice as long without growth capital, but you can still get there. And I think that's the kind of businesses people should be aspiring to build anyway. So don't write that roadmap that says like month 6 we need to get investment, or we're gonna or the lights are off. Like, just plan like you won't get investment, and then you'll be a good enough company that someone like Scott might invest in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
A lot of it's been covered, which similar thoughts. But I guess if you used in your question, it was about investment. If I'm not
right,
that.
Yeah.
So, I actually think one of the key things, if you're looking for investment, look, I've seen some pretty interesting things, just like Scott has said. At what period of time will an investor come in and invest in someone and their idea? And it can be just that. But generally speaking, I would go for traction. What traction can you demonstrate to an investor that, here it comes again, like a broken record, that you've got product market fit, that customers want what you're building, that you've got some paying customers, or if it's a freemium model or whatever it is, there are users and this is what they're saying. And once you can demonstrate that traction to investors, I think you're well on your way.
Amazing. Are there any business needs that you've seen in recent weeks as a result of COVID that you think the startups of tomorrow should address? Scott, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm chuckling because in many ways, as horrible as COVID has been from an entrepreneurial standpoint, I hate to say it, it's almost like somebody just hit the big reset button on dozens of industries. So everything from healthcare to groceries to home delivery, there's tremendous opportunity there. And I would tell you to look within every single space and think about whether or not the way things, quote unquote, have always been done are still the best way to do them. And my guess is, based on what's happened as a result of the pandemic, the answer is, oh, heck no. So at this point, you can find just about every space. You just have to look at how the paradigms are shifting, how customer behavior is shifting. People are spending more on household essentials. They're looking for convenience and value over luxury. Think about what that does from a business standpoint. So whether you're dealing with hospitality, entertainment, there are ways to get it done. And by the way, we deal with businesses. I'm seeing businesses that have been around for 20 or 30 years that are laying off their entire team because suddenly there's no real world, there's no face-to-face, there's no get-togethers. We do a lot of event planning, live programming, conferences and such. But as you can see here, there's tremendous demand for online, face-to-face, still human connection through digital channels, which means that there's a lot of opportunity for suppliers and vendors in that area. So don't psych yourself out. I mean, in many ways, you just got hit with a giant great evener that's created so much opportunity where you can go toe-to-toe with the big boys that I would argue there's, again, never been a better time to dip your toe in the waters.
Richard, do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%, 1,000%. We're not looking at, the obvious thing is how to digitize how we interact with services and products. But beyond that, which we've touched on, look at just things like, I was reading some interesting stats and just things like gaming, online streaming, on-demand services, food tech, for the obvious reason. There's a ton, even pet care has skyrocketed because we've got time for our pets perhaps. But, I'd be looking at ways and how you can add some innovation to those sectors that have much higher demands now because of post-COVID, because our habits have changed. DIY, home fitness, all of those sectors. There's like Scott said, it's absolutely a perfect time to look into those sectors.
Yeah. Aaron, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's two great points from Scott and Richard. I agree. I think it is great timing, and there is obviously many kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities from like the touchless airports that Richard described to what's the future of work looking like. EdTech is kind of boomed. I'm working with a couple of EdTech companies, the Founders Factory and outside, and the demand has just been unbelievable. And not only the demand from the consumers, but also from the students, but also the demand from the institutions, which have been relatively have had their barriers up for a long time. And I think we're seeing that in many industries like healthcare, education, even like government and policy and politics. And they're having to kind of adopt technology because they were forced to do so. And it's a great leveler because it does kind of put us almost like 20, 30 years into the future. Like these archaic industries are forced to kind of acknowledge that technology will be the way forward, and they've been forced to kind of adopt it, or at least try it now. And now they've got that trust, it's less intimidating, and they can see how it can actually deliver going forward. I think one of the interesting things that I'm quite interested about how it will pan out is as the future of work changes. So my company, Founders Factory, we were kind of in the office 5 days a week kind of company, but now going forward from September, we're going to kind of create this hybrid remote working model. And from many companies I've spoken to and other colleagues and friends in the industry, it seems to be the same. So we're going to kind of get this like knowledge drain, or like drain of like workers from these kind of city hubs. But then I've been reading a few articles around how knowledge workers, as far as like office workers, actually impacts 8 or 9 or 10 other jobs just by kind of going to work back. So I think how those kind of periphery jobs and services kind of readjust and adapt, I definitely think there's opportunities for solutions. I think there's a problem there, and it'd be interesting to see how from a societal level address this.
One of the things that I'm seeing in the chat is that, one of our community members is saying that the challenge is having the skill gap, right? So knowing that you need certain things, but not necessarily having the professional training or maybe the experience in that particular thing, whether it's online marketing or, programming or whatever it may be. What advice do you usually give for people who, they have this big idea, but maybe they don't even have, the skill they need to make that minimal viable product that you were talking about, Scott? Do you want to jump in on that first?
I was going to say, I hear there's this website called Fiverr where you can find a lot of help with that. Rumor has it. But no, I jest. But the reality is today, this is all a click or call away. So any skill set, any talent, any service, a lot of it you can buy on demand, off the shelf, ready to go. Or you can find people to partner with who can help you free or at a very cost affordable rate. There's online communities where you can go, like we're saying, these virtual meet and greets. There's founders groups, all sorts of places you can go. And that's the beauty of this, is you can obtain a lot of that talent and assistance much faster than you ever could. The hardest step is always going, I'm not qualified, I don't know where to start. But the minute you can get to step 1, steps 2, 3, 4, and 500, that all goes in sync. That goes a heck of a lot easier once you start thinking to yourself, wait a minute, this is all at my fingertips. Maybe there's not this huge psychological roadblock. And I know that's easy to say. It's not like you're going to find the ideal software engineer to help you build your app overnight. It takes time. You have to work with different providers, test things out, try and assemble a team. But again, it's eminently, you don't need to go off and get a college degree, or I don't want to say necessarily take venture capital backing or investment, because Lord knows every once in a while we can add some value. But I would tell you there's actually a lot to gain by learning to do a lot of this stuff yourself. But again, you as an entrepreneur don't have to do everything. It's really about those partnerships, teamwork, opportunities that you form with others. That's really going to help you springboard to opportunity. Richard,
what is your advice on that?
Oh, it's not too different to Scott's nailed that. You know, some of the best if I just think back as to some of the best founders we see, it's the ones that can hustle and wear 20 different hats. They'll be creating a video, they'll be doing a bit of graphic design, they'll be out hustling, talking to potential customers. They're the sales guy. There's them. You know, they'll learn social media pretty quick. You know, they'll just do absolutely everything. And you know, that's really what they need to be doing, and that's what I'd be advising them, that they need to wear all those hats. When they get to a point where they need to start employing their first, you know, team members, again, we get asked this question, oh, you know, do I get a CFO, a CTO, a COO? You know, do you know what? I always ask the question, what are you into your startup and what are you not good at? And so what you're not good at, then go employ someone to be good at that. You know, otherwise, in the meantime, hustling and doing everything yourself, absolutely use a website. I do it. Use websites like Fiverr. Get some creative help to create videos for near nothing. You know, you got the world as a pool of talent to go and get. And yeah, okay, you got to find them and find the right fit, and does the brief match their skill set? But once you do that, it's very, very it's bootstrapped. It's done on a shoestring budget.
Yeah, I think the golden piece of advice that I pulled out from that is that you have to know what you're not good at. And I think a lot of times it's, at least for me, and I know other people, it's hard to admit what you're not good at, right? So Aaron, when you're talking to the different founders in your circle and in your community, how do you express that to them in a way where that doesn't make them feel, you know, upset for thinking that they're not good at something?
Sure. I suppose most of the interactions I have with founders is from a kind of coaching perspective, because it is important. Like, you can't just jump in and do the thing for them, or else when you're not there, they won't be able to kind of cope. And there are some founders that can pick things up, and then there's some founders that can't. And the advice is to kind of outsource cheaply using tools like Fiverr and the other options available, or kind of just try and find a way to be kind of 50% happy with it to ship it. And I think people have sometimes too high a bar of perfection that it stops them, or they have low confidence that they're just not willing to ship it unless it's perfect. The truth is, it will never be perfect. And by the time it is, it's probably too late. So I always encourage founders just to give it a go and to ship it. And then it's like, it's later you can kind of finesse as you go. It's ever-evolving thing, startups, things like social media, digital marketing, websites, etc. Like, none of them are finite assets that go and disappear. Like, they stay there, and you can work and improve them over time. So I think it's like the big piece is kind of just coaching them in confidence that it's okay to ship something you're embarrassed about in the beginning.
Right.
Because you can make it better.
Scott, have you run into people over time who have been kind of unable to admit what they're not good at and don't know how to ask for help?
Never. You might be looking at one. I will neither confirm nor deny. As entrepreneurs, we tend to want to do everything, but you learn very quickly when you get pulled in so many directions. You kind of have to outsource and delegate some things. But I would actually tell you that the thing that I'm very bullish about is that the most important skill, and we really try and coach entrepreneurs to keep this in mind, that you can give yourself, is to learn how to learn, to get yourself in a tinkerer's mindset, like Richard and Aaron were saying, where basically you're willing to go out, you're willing to experiment. You may not be great at something, but you don't always have to be. I'm not a web designer by trade, but these days I can build websites in 90 minutes using off-the-shelf plug-and-play tools. So the other thing that I want to point out, and I know you guys will have more discussion about this later, is that we often talk about diversity in business. And I want to say it's important for founders to think about going beyond that from a cultural standpoint, to also cultivate diversity of experiences, opinions, and backgrounds. You really tend to, as people, we tend to surround ourselves with others like ourselves from similar backgrounds and experiences. But diversity really can be the ultimate source of competitive advantage, because the idea is, if you're great at something, do you really need 17 people on the team that have redundant skills? You really want to pair up with the people who fill in those gaps in your skill set or weaknesses in your knowledge or experience. So just try and do your best to create a diverse team and people who back you up. And the more well-rounded everybody is, the more successful you're going to be.
Richard is. Go ahead, Richard.
May I just add one final point to this, if it is a final point? But again, if I reflect on what everyone's saying here and think about some of our best founders that have come through the program, considering everything said, it's those founders that are very open to feedback and not take things personal. I think that was said already. Not being so in love with what they're doing and their idea that they don't want to change. And I think Scott referred to it. It's it's 9 out of 10 startups come out not doing what they originally entered in to start out and do in the first place. So that ability to be able to pivot, and they'll get conflict, like our founders get conflicting opinions within our program from different mentors with different backgrounds. But it's also having that open mind to take on that feedback, but two, knowing when to pivot and what to listen to and what you'll just take on board and may not. Because if you're going to listen to absolutely everyone, you'll be jumping around, pivoting all day long. Does that make sense? So
yeah,
it's a lot of stuff's subjective, but there's certain things you got to go, right, that's a pivot. Sorry, Scott.
So actually, Rick, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say, you bring up a great point there. We actually talk about the concept of strong but weakly held opinions. So basically, any decision you make in business is a hypothesis, and you want to do your homework as best as possible up front so you can gather the information you need to make a smart decision. But you don't, again, want to be so married to that idea that as you get more feedback that you can't pivot or adjust your strategy. The whole point is you're constantly experimenting and testing. As long as you consider yourself to be in a mode of permanent beta, so to speak, always improving, I think you're going to do just fine.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that startups have going for them, because we talk a lot about how larger businesses can benefit from these startup methodologies, right? And it's always operating under the assumption that you can change. It sometimes can get a little messy, but I think that it makes you so agile and it allows you to be innovative and think about new opinions and new ideas and add things to your creative process that maybe if you were an older business that was more traditional in its ways and set in its ways, that you wouldn't make those adjustments, right? Because you have those steps already in place. There's already a chain of command, so to speak. So I think that that's great advice. When we talk about diversity as well in building teams, is that something, Aaron, that you also give as advice to the founders in your circle?
Yeah, I think so. It's one of the earlier I said, find your co-founders from your own networks, but that is also kind of plagued by the fact that the people, it might just be the people that look like you, sound like you, come from the same places as you, and then as that compounds and you kind of, if you keep building out that function, you get very undiverse teams by the time you're 10 people and so on. So it is encouraged to bring in diverse talent as soon as you can. And I think most importantly, it's diversity in sex and race and all of those things matter, but it's just mindset. Being able to have people from different backgrounds at the table when you're making these big decisions in the early days is incredibly useful. So it's something we definitely encourage our startups that we work with. The Founders Factory companies that I consult with outside Founders Factory, it's the same thing. It's very important.
Great. Yeah. So we touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about these on-demand services. What types of business needs do you see are being outsourced and are on the rise and becoming increasingly popular to find these on-demand solutions for? Scott, let's start with you.
Marketing, search engine optimization, advertising, content development, programming, delivery. Just about anything you name it. One of the first pieces of advice we give to startups is to think about what do you really need to keep in-house and what can you cost affordably outsource out that you can get done more efficiently. And it's learning to let go. That's one of the most important skill sets you can have as an entrepreneur. And in fact, one of the rules of thumb we say is that if somebody can do something about 70% as good as you can do it, as long as it's not a critical business function, then go ahead and offload it. And think about what your time is worth and take that time back and use it to work on more high value activities. But I think, as you can see on sites like Fiverr, there's a huge array of categories in which people are going to be looking to gig economy workers. There's all sorts of online solutions and tools that you can turn to build just about anything in a matter of hours for pennies on the dollar. So again, I think what you're going to see is more and more teams are going to be virtualized, and they're going to be using these on-demand, plug-and-play, mix-and-match solutions to create some amazing things.
Richard, do you agree with that? And what trends have you been seeing?
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. And it's not too different. I'm always the advocate of a lean startup process and bootstrapping. And when I work with startups in the very beginning, at concept stage, so not too different. We'll jump on a on-demand site like Fiverr and get a logo and a brand, creating a video explainer to any of that, creating a basic website, and those sorts of creative talents. But as Scott said, there's loads of things you can get legal. You can get all sorts of advice and help for anyone just to drop into a project. So that's what we do. We encourage our founders to go to sites like Fiverr to get that work done, get some help, bootstrap it for little cost, and take it from there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's loads of other things I can think of that just come to mind. Sorry, Beth, but
no, that's okay.
Just using free software, Balsamiq, Sketch, there's so much of that you don't really need. There are a lot of plug and play platforms that you don't really need a design background. Just getting as much of that done yourself before you then take it on. And as Scott said, then your time's worth more to start strategizing in the business and then start outsourcing that more and paying for better services and more expensive services.
Yeah, I mean, I myself, and I'll be the first person to tell you that I am not very technologically advanced, but I've used Balsamiq to make wireframes. I've used the website builders that exist, right? Like I've used Fiverr services, obviously. So, I think the biggest mental hurdle is like realizing that that's even an option, because to your point, Scott, as an entrepreneur, you tend to think that you have to do everything yourself. So Aaron, do you have any advice for kind of like shifting that mindset and like learning to see the bigger picture?
Yeah, definitely. And it's to quote Scott from earlier when he spoke about that hustle culture. I find entrepreneurs, and I was a bit falsely of this as well when I was younger. You're more happy to give up hundreds of hours of your week than £100. You hold on with such a tighter grip on money and capital than you do on your own time, which like isn't healthy in the early days. I think as Richard mentioned, so I'm a designer by trade, and a long time ago I was listed on Fiverr. It helped me make ends meet when I was at university. And I think one thing I've seen as a designer is, as tools have improved, I've been able to do more. So personally, just carrying design skills, I've been able to now with tools like Webflow and like some no-code tools, you can almost do like low-level front-end development, or even some complex like apps and database type things. So I think there is a lot that you can do yourself, and you don't necessarily need to come from a design background. It's just about doing it, and then I suppose admitting to yourself that you can only take it so far, and that the opportunity cost of you grinding out for the whole weekend to get it to another 10% better, it might actually be better spending £50 or £100 on a freelancer and getting them in to kind of turn it over and get it to 50% better.
Yeah.
I think that opportunity cost piece, I often say to founders, because I never really mapped that myself. Like, opportunity cost now is how I make decisions about how I do everyday things, let alone professional things. So I think it is, especially if you are doing 9 to 5, and then you're coming home and working on your startup on the weekends, and you're kind of grinding. Like, it's important to measure your opportunity cost and value your hours and respect that you know so much.
Yeah, I think that you touch on something really powerful, which is the idea of work-life balance as an entrepreneur. And I want to quickly ask you guys, how do you know? I mean, something you said really stuck out to me. It's like you'd rather spend 100 hours of your time than $100 of your capital. But I think that that's, first of all, absurdly true, because even in my professional life, I would not identify myself as an entrepreneur, but in my professional life, as a business person, I also have that same mentality where it's like, I can take on everything. I'd rather, do everything myself with my human capacity versus like output and capital. But that can cause people to burn out, right? And especially if you're a founder or an entrepreneur that's just starting out, how do you judge what's worth your time and investment and what's something that's not? Scott, I think that you have some good input on that, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, that's a tough challenge. You really have to ask yourself at the end of the day if it's a task that only you can perform, and if it's one that directly either produces revenue or opportunities for the business. I always encourage folks to be what I call relentlessly practical. And that doesn't mean being a negative Nancy. It just means getting down to brass tacks and thinking about what your time is worth and the opportunity is attached to any given choice. As Aaron points out, there are two costs. There's that financial dollar one, and there's the missed opportunities that you can't take on if you're too busy down in the weeds. The other thing, too, that I want people to keep in mind here is that money is a tool, right? It's not the be-all, end-all goal. And you really should be making your money work harder for you versus trying to work harder for your money at the end of the day. Otherwise, you're going to burn out and hit a wall. So think about where you can get the most value for any given expenditure. And again, think about things that multiply opportunities for you. So if somebody else builds your website and they do a better job and it gives you the time back and they can produce a much better piece while you're using the same time to build other wonderful things or go out and pitch to customers, that's a win. At the end of the day, what you're really thinking about is trying to right-size opportunities, right-size time and cost investments, and not being so married to the ideal that you have to do everything hands-on or be involved. Again, it really is just that calculus of, does this create new opportunities? Does this put cash in the bank? Does it put me in front of customer audiences that are important? Does it help me gain knowledge, experience, and capabilities that maybe I can apply to other endeavors? And when you're thinking about underwriting any given cost, maybe also think about the fact that you might not use a technology or a tool or a piece of insight that you gained in one area in the manner you initially thought. Maybe you have to adapt it to something else, or maybe that's a better way to amortize that cost. So it really is taking a big picture, long-term goal, not being so focused on short-term immediate needs.
Yeah, that makes sense. Richard, how do you balance that in your own life? Because I'm sure that, all of us schedules are hectic, right? So how do you kind of define what is worth in your time and valuable for you to be a part of versus maybe what you can delegate to a team?
Yeah, it's probably not too different, I would say, to how I would advise, our founders. If, like, for example, I was just thinking as Scott was talking there, a founder came in and to one of our cohorts and done this incredible branding exercise, which costs a few grand. But by the time they went through our cohort, the company wasn't even called that brand anymore, because they got that critical feedback and they did the validation and they pivoted, and it needed to be a different brand. So I guess what I would advise is, if you are not sure and you're still in that validation stage, which is a big part of the company, the startup process, I would bootstrap. That's why I would bootstrap. You do those things yourself. Jump on those cheap sites and make up a brand for 50 quid rather than thousands. Because if it changes, you don't mind losing 50 pounds. Or if you can do it yourself because you've got a bit of skill, or you jump online and learn how to do something. We've all done that. I still do it. the amount of times I'm on YouTube learning how to do stuff so I can do it myself. But when I know that it's the right decision and this is what I need done, then I'll go out and pay someone a lot of money to put that video together, because that's how we're going to do it. We've done all this research up front. I'm not sure if that's making sense, but in that learning stage, do it yourself, bootstrap. Then when you're sure you're going to market this way, or you need some creative piece project done a certain way, then pay for it.
Yeah.
Work-life balance has been asked. Personally, I make sure I do stuff. Like every other day I'll go for a run, or I make sure I'll just stop and pick up my book, put my laptop down, and read a chapter. It's things like that. I'm constantly challenging our founders. What have you done this week that's fun?
Right.
And it's quite interesting how, like when you say you referred to burnout, it's very typical, because they're bootstrapping, they're doing everything themselves. But, you've got to balance that out. It's easy to talk the talk, but walking that walk is really challenging. I struggle with it. I get burnout, but then, there's days or weeks or months that I'm better at it, and I'm doing more. I'm balancing that out more with stuff I like doing.
Yeah. Aaron, how do you feel about that too? I mean, I know that you're advising a lot of people, but do you turn that advice back on yourself? How do you find that balance?
Speaking personally, I think lockdown has done me wonders. It's given me permission to maybe claw back a bit more work-life balance, and I have a full intention of kind of keeping this going forward post-lockdown. I think the important thing, and I realized this maybe 3-4 years ago, I like to think of myself as quite a meticulous person, and I do live by my calendar in my professional life. And then the big moment, because I was just struggling with a few side projects, speaking to with work as well. And the big thing that happened was when I started to also put my personal life into my calendar. And I would block out time where I had given myself permission to have the weekend off or have the Saturday off. And that was a big turning point for me. And ever since then, I've had a much better handle both how I kind of work, and obviously I'm in the startup industry, so we are working a lot, but then also just giving myself the time to also sit down and just look at my calendar for a month forward and a month back and realize, okay, there's no personal time here. And maybe I need to do that put some time in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just have one final question. We're talking about the growing prominence of remote work. How do you see that impacting, the way that we start businesses now if we're all coming from this remote space? Scott, why don't we look to you?
Sure. I think it's just going to require us to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more understanding, but it also forces us to look to online communities, new sources of talent, new sources of partnership. But the irony is, we're talking about how this is maybe a new way to do business. It's very similar in many ways to those of us who started out on the bulletin board scenes 30 years ago were doing things. You found people via computer. And I would actually argue that making those connections is easier than it's ever been. So the beauty of this remote work and video conferencing and all that is it allows people to find talent whenever, wherever, on demand, and it allows them to effectively work together in a manner that's much more flexible, fluid, and cost-effective to boot. So I wouldn't get too hung up on it. It sucks that we're not able to get together as much face-to-face in person. Certainly puts a damper on the happy hours. But at the same time, a lot of people have built businesses, especially in the tech and consumer spaces, this way for a very, very long time. And I'm confident at this point, a lot of people are going to come up with some great ideas and make it work as well.
Well, we can get together just like this, right? Awesome.
Absolutely, 100%.
Well, I want to thank you guys. We're out of time, but I really appreciate all of you being here today. I know that I benefited a lot from hearing from you. So thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.